Thomas Whitmore had served the British royal family for 43 years. As head of the Queen's personal security detail, he had seen things that would never make it into history books. But nothing had prepared him for the weight of the secret he carried for 7 decades. It was a cold morning in November when Thomas finally decided to speak. At 89 years old, sitting in his modest cottage in the countryside, he knew his time was running short. The secret that had eaten away at him for so long could not die with him. The story began in 1952, just months after young Elizabeth became queen. Thomas was only 19 then, fresh-faced and eager to serve the crown. He had been assigned to night duty at Windsor Castle, a position most guards found boring. But Thomas loved the quiet halls and the sense of history that surrounded him. On that fateful night in March 1952, Thomas was making his rounds when he heard unusual sounds coming from the Queen's private quarters. Not the kind of sounds that would suggest danger, but something else entirely. Soft crying, hushed voices, and what sounded like a baby's gentle whimpers. Thomas knew better than to investigate royal privacy, but something felt different that night. The Queen's trusted doctor, Sir William Hartley, had been coming and going for weeks. Staff members whispered about the Queen feeling unwell, but no official announcements were made. As Thomas passed by a side entrance, he saw Sir William leaving with a small bundle wrapped in royal blue blankets. The doctor's face was grave, and he moved with unusual urgency. Behind him walked Margaret Rhodes, the Queen's closest cousin and confidant, her eyes red from crying. Thomas pretended to be checking the locks, but his heart was racing. What he had witnessed didn't make sense. The Queen had given birth to Prince Charles just 3 years earlier, and there had been no announcement of another pregnancy. The palace would never hide such important news from the public. The next morning brought strange changes to the castle routine. Several staff members who had worked the previous night were suddenly transferred to other royal residences. The Queen's personal maid, who had served her faithfully for years, was given an unexpected holiday to Scotland. Even the castle's head cook was reassigned to Balmoral without explanation. Thomas watched these changes with growing suspicion. In his short time serving the royal family, he had learned that such sudden staff movements were highly unusual. The royals valued consistency and familiar faces around them. Something significant had happened, and someone was making sure that as few people as possible knew about it. During the following weeks, Thomas noticed that the Queen seemed different. She appeared tired and sometimes sad, which was unusual for someone who had always shown such strength and composure. Prince Philip was more protective than usual, often walking close beside her during public appearances. One evening, while organizing security schedules in his small office, Thomas overheard a heated conversation between 2 senior palace officials. They were discussing the arrangement and how it needed to remain absolutely confidential for the good of the monarchy. One man mentioned a family in the countryside who had been specially chosen and were being well compensated for their discretion. Thomas began to piece together what he had witnessed. The bundle in Sir William's arms, the sudden staff changes, the whispered conversations about arrangements and secrecy. Could it be possible that the Queen had given birth to a child that the public would never know about? The young guard struggled with what to do. His loyalty to the crown was absolute, but the magnitude of what he suspected kept him awake at night. He had sworn an oath to protect the royal family. But did that include protecting them from the truth being revealed decades later? As months passed, Thomas occasionally saw Sir William visiting other members of the royal household. The doctor always carried the same serious expression, and these visits often coincided with meetings involving lawyers and financial advisors. Money was changing hands, papers were being signed, and everyone involved maintained strict silence. Thomas decided to conduct his own quiet investigation. He began paying attention to which staff members had been present that night in March and tracking where they had been transferred. Most had been sent to remote royal properties in Scotland or given early retirement with generous pensions. The pattern was clear. Anyone who might have witnessed what happened was being moved far away from public attention. The breakthrough came 6 months later when Thomas befriended an elderly gardener named Albert who had worked at the castle for 30 years. Albert had been reassigned to maintain the grounds at a small estate in the Lake District, but he had returned to collect some personal belongings. Over tea in the servants' quarters, Albert shared what he had seen. On that March night, he had been working late in the greenhouse when he saw a car leave the castle grounds. The car was driven by one of the Queen's most trusted advisors and carried Sir William, along with what appeared to be a young woman holding a baby. Albert had recognized the woman as Sarah Mitchell, a distant cousin of the royal family, who had been staying at the castle for several months. Sarah had been introduced as someone recovering from a difficult time in her life, but palace staff noticed she had kept to herself and rarely appeared in public areas of the castle. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place for Thomas. The Queen had indeed given birth to a child, but for reasons he could only guess at, the baby had been given to another family to raise. The child would grow up knowing nothing of their true heritage, while the world remained unaware of their existence. Thomas realized he was now one of only a handful of people who knew the truth about the Queen's hidden son. The weight of this knowledge would stay with him for the rest of his life, changing how he viewed everything he thought he knew about the royal family. For the next 5 years, Thomas carried his secret while continuing to serve the royal family with unwavering dedication. He watched Prince Charles grow from a toddler into a young boy, always wondering about the other child who should have been playing alongside him. The child who would never know he was born into the most famous family in the world. Thomas's position in the royal household gradually improved as his superiors recognized his discretion and loyalty. By 1957, he had been promoted to senior guard and was often assigned to accompany the Queen on her official visits. This new role gave him access to conversations and situations that few people ever witnessed. During a state visit to France, Thomas overheard a private conversation between the Queen and her private secretary that would haunt him for years. They were discussing annual payments being made to a family in Gloucestershire, payments that were described as essential for maintaining the arrangement and ensuring continued silence. The Queen's voice carried a sadness that Thomas had never heard before. She spoke about the sacrifice made for the greater good, and her hope that the child would have a good life. Even without knowing the truth, her private secretary assured her that the family was providing excellent care and that the boy was healthy and happy. Thomas felt his heart race as he realized they were talking about the hidden son. The child was alive, well, and being raised by another family somewhere in the English countryside. The payments ensured not only the child's care but also the family's silence about his true parentage. Curiosity consumed Thomas, but he knew that any attempt to investigate further could cost him his position and possibly his freedom. Instead, he focused on observing the Queen more closely, looking for signs of the emotional burden she carried. He noticed that every year around the child's birthday in March, the Queen would become more reflective and sometimes melancholy. She would often request time alone in her private study, where Thomas could see her looking through what appeared to be photographs or letters. These moments of solitude always coincided with visits from Sir William, who would spend long hours in private consultation with her. One autumn day in 1958, Thomas was assigned to security detail during a royal visit to a children's hospital in Gloucestershire. As their convoy passed through small villages on the way to the hospital, Thomas noticed the Queen paying unusual attention to the children playing in schoolyards and local parks. At one point, their car stopped at a traffic signal next to a primary school. Through the fence, they could see dozens of children playing during their lunch break. The Queen's gaze fixed on a particular boy who appeared to be about 6 years old. The child had distinctive features that seemed strikingly familiar to Thomas. The boy had the same deep blue eyes as the Queen, the same strong jawline that was characteristic of the royal family, and a way of carrying himself that seemed almost regal despite his young age. He was playing with other children, but there was something different about him, a natural confidence that set him apart from his peers. Thomas watched as the Queen's face showed a mixture of pride, longing, and deep sadness. Her hand moved slightly toward the window as if she wanted to reach out to the child, but she caught herself and quickly looked away. The traffic light changed and their convoy moved on, but Thomas could see that the Queen remained deeply affected by what she had seen. That evening, while the Queen attended an official dinner, Thomas took the opportunity to drive back through the same village. He parked near the school and waited until classes ended, hoping to see the boy again. When the children were dismissed, Thomas watched as the same child walked to a modest cottage nearby, where he was greeted by a middle-aged couple who clearly adored him. The man appeared to be a local farmer, and the woman seemed to work as a seamstress based on the fabric and sewing materials Thomas could see through their front window. They lived simply but comfortably, and their genuine affection for the boy was obvious. The child ran into the woman's arms and showed her something he had made at school, his face bright with excitement. Thomas realized he was looking at the Queen's hidden son living a completely normal life, unaware that his real mother was one of the most powerful women in the world. The boy seemed happy and well cared for, surrounded by people who loved him as their own child. Over the following months, Thomas found excuses to visit that area of Gloucestershire whenever possible. He learned that the boy's name was James Mitchell, and that he was known in the village as the son of Robert and Mary Mitchell, a childless couple who had adopted him as a baby. The villagers considered the family ordinary and unremarkable, which was exactly what the royal arrangement needed. James excelled at school and was popular with his classmates. He showed an interest in history and seemed particularly fascinated by stories about knights and castles. His teachers described him as bright, well-mannered, and mature for his age. These qualities reminded Thomas strongly of Prince Charles, who displayed similar characteristics. The most striking thing about James was his natural leadership abilities. Even at age 6, other children seemed drawn to him and often looked to him for guidance during their games. He had an instinctive sense of fairness and justice that reminded Thomas of the Queen's own strong moral compass. Thomas began to understand the enormous sacrifice the Queen had made. She had given up her own son to protect the monarchy from a scandal that could have shaken the foundation of the royal family. The reasons for this decision remained a mystery to Thomas, but the pain it caused the Queen was evident in her behavior, whenever anything reminded her of the child she could never publicly acknowledge. As James grew older, Thomas noticed that the Queen's annual visits to Gloucestershire became more frequent. She would often request tours of local schools, hospitals, and community centers, using these official duties as opportunities to catch glimpses of her hidden son. Each time, Thomas could see both joy and heartbreak in her eyes as she watched the boy from a distance. The secret was taking its toll on Thomas as well. He had become emotionally invested in this child's welfare and found himself worrying about what would happen to James as he grew older. Would he ever learn the truth about his parentage? Would the Queen ever be able to acknowledge him? And what would happen to all the people who knew the secret when they eventually passed away? By 1965, Thomas had been promoted to head of the Queen's personal security detail. This position gave him unprecedented access to royal communications and private meetings. It was during this time that he learned more disturbing details about the circumstances surrounding James Mitchell's birth and the reasons for the elaborate cover-up. The revelation came during a crisis meeting at Buckingham Palace. A journalist had been asking questions about unexplained payments made by the royal household to various families across Britain. While investigating these payments, the reporter had stumbled across financial records that suggested the palace was supporting children who had no official connection to the royal family. Thomas was present during an emergency meeting between the Queen, Prince Philip, and several senior advisors. The discussion was heated and filled with tension as they debated how to handle the journalists' inquiries without revealing the truth about James and potentially other hidden children. It was during this meeting that Thomas learned the shocking truth about why James had been hidden from the world. The Queen's private secretary revealed that James had not been conceived during the Queen's marriage to Prince Philip. The child was the result of a brief but intense relationship that occurred before the Queen's engagement was officially announced. The father was described as someone of unsuitable background who could never be accepted by the British establishment or the Church of England. If the truth about James's parentage had become public in 1952, it would have created a constitutional crisis that could have threatened the monarchy's very existence. The decision to hide James had been made by a small group of senior royal advisors who believed that protecting the institution of the monarchy was more important than any individual's personal happiness, including the Queen's. They had arranged for James to be placed with a carefully selected family who could provide him with a good life while maintaining absolute secrecy about his origins. Thomas felt sick as he listened to the cold, calculating way these men discussed the Queen's son as if he were merely a problem to be managed rather than a human being with rights and feelings. He could see the pain in the Queen's eyes as she was reminded of the sacrifice she had been forced to make for the sake of her duty to the crown. The journalists' investigation was eventually halted through a combination of legal pressure and financial incentives, but the incident had rattled everyone involved in maintaining the secret. Additional security measures were put in place to ensure that James's true identity would never be discovered. Thomas was assigned to personally oversee these new security measures, which included regular surveillance of the Mitchell family to ensure their continued silence and loyalty. This assignment allowed him to observe James more closely as the boy grew into his teenage years. James had developed into a remarkable young man. At 13, he was tall for his age, with the distinctive Windsor features becoming more pronounced as he matured. His resemblance to Prince Charles was now undeniable to anyone who knew to look for it. But fortunately, very few people were in a position to make that connection. The boy excelled academically and showed particular aptitude for languages and history. His adoptive parents, Robert and Mary Mitchell, had done an excellent job raising him with strong moral values and a sense of responsibility toward others. James was popular at school and showed natural leadership qualities that reminded Thomas of the Queen herself. What troubled Thomas most was watching James struggle with questions about his identity that his adoptive parents could never fully answer. The teenager had begun asking more pointed questions about his background and why he looked so different from the Mitchells. His adoptive parents, bound by their agreement with the palace, could only provide vague answers that clearly frustrated the intelligent young man. During one of his surveillance visits, Thomas overheard James telling a friend that he sometimes felt like he didn't truly belong anywhere. The boy described having dreams about living in a grand castle and being part of a large, important family. These dreams, which James dismissed as silly fantasies, were actually his subconscious mind recognizing his true heritage. Thomas began to question whether the decision to hide James had truly been in the boy's best interests. While James was clearly loved and well cared for by the Mitchells, he was also being denied his birthright and his true identity. The teenager was growing up feeling incomplete, not understanding why he felt so different from everyone around him. The situation became even more complicated when James began showing interest in the royal family. He followed news about the Queen and her children with unusual intensity, collecting newspaper clippings and watching every televised royal event. His adoptive parents tried to discourage this interest, fearing it might somehow lead to dangerous questions, but James's fascination only grew stronger. Thomas watched with growing concern as James developed what appeared to be an inexplicable connection to his real family. The teenager would become excited whenever he saw news about Prince Charles and would often comment on how he felt he understood the prince's thoughts and feelings. During royal visits to nearby areas, James would always find ways to join the crowds of well-wishers, standing as close as possible to the Queen and her family. On one particularly memorable occasion, James managed to get close enough to hand the Queen a bouquet of flowers during a royal walkabout. Thomas watched as the Queen's face showed instant recognition of her son, though she maintained her composure and accepted the flowers with her usual gracious smile. For a brief moment, mother and son stood face to face, neither knowing that the other understood their true relationship. That evening, Thomas observed the Queen in her private chambers, holding the simple bouquet that James had given her. She had dismissed all her attendants and sat alone, touching the flowers gently while tears ran down her face. It was one of the most heartbreaking scenes Thomas had ever witnessed, a mother mourning the relationship she could never have with her own child. The incident reinforced Thomas's growing belief that the secret was causing more harm than good. James was unconsciously seeking his real family, while the Queen was suffering in silence, unable to acknowledge the son who stood right in front of her. The elaborate deception that was supposed to protect everyone involved was instead creating pain and confusion for all concerned. Thomas began to seriously consider whether he should find a way to tell James the truth, even though doing so would violate every oath he had taken and could result in serious legal consequences. The boy deserved to know who he really was, and the Queen deserved to have some kind of relationship with her son, even if it had to remain secret. As James approached his 16th birthday, Thomas realized that time was running out to make this decision. Soon the young man would be old enough to start making his own choices about his future, and those choices should be based on the truth about his identity rather than the comfortable lies he had been told throughout his childhood. The decision that would change everything came in 1968 when James turned 16. Thomas had been watching the young man struggle with his identity for years, and he could no longer stand by and do nothing. The final push came when he discovered that James was planning to leave school and join the military. Hoping that army life might help him find the sense of purpose and belonging he had been searching for. Thomas knew that if James joined the military, he would be subjected to extensive background checks that might reveal inconsistencies in his official records. The palace had done an excellent job creating false documents for James, but military intelligence was thorough, and any investigation might uncover the truth in ways that could be catastrophic for everyone involved. After weeks of internal struggle, Thomas made a decision that would violate every oath he had taken and put his entire life at risk. He would find a way to tell James the truth about his parentage, but he would do it in a way that protected both the boy and the Queen from immediate scandal. The opportunity came during one of James's regular visits to a local library where he spent hours reading about British history and the royal family. Thomas had been observing these visits as part of his surveillance duties, and he knew that James always sat in the same quiet corner where he could read undisturbed. Thomas approached the library during one of James's visits, disguised as an ordinary citizen doing research. He sat at a nearby table and waited for the right moment to make contact. When James got up to find another book, Thomas left a carefully prepared envelope in the exact spot where the young man had been sitting. The envelope contained a letter that Thomas had spent weeks writing and rewriting. It began with a simple statement: "James, what you are about to read will change your life forever, but you deserve to know the truth about who you really are." The letter went on to explain that James was not the biological son of Robert and Mary Mitchell, but rather the child of a very important family who had been forced to give him up for complicated reasons. Thomas was careful not to explicitly name the Queen as James's mother, but he provided enough clues that an intelligent young man could piece together the truth. He included details about James's birth date, the location where he was born, and the fact that his biological mother was someone who could never publicly acknowledge him, but who loved him deeply, and had been watching over him from a distance throughout his life. The letter concluded with instructions for James to meet Thomas at a specific location if he wanted to learn more. Thomas chose an ancient chapel in the countryside, far from any populated areas where they might be observed. He told James to come alone and to tell no one about the letter or the meeting. For 3 days, Thomas waited anxiously to see if James would appear at the designated meeting place. On the 3rd day, just as the sun was setting, Thomas saw a familiar figure walking up the path to the chapel. James had come, and he was carrying the letter in his hand. The young man looked older than his 16 years as he approached Thomas. The confusion and questions that had plagued him throughout his childhood had been replaced by a determined need to understand the truth. When he spoke, his voice carried a maturity that reminded Thomas strongly of the Queen. James began by asking direct questions about Thomas's identity and how he knew so much about James's background. Thomas explained that he worked for James's biological family and had been watching over him for years to ensure his safety and well-being. He was careful to emphasize that everything that had been done was motivated by love and a desire to protect James, not by shame or rejection. The conversation that followed lasted for hours. Thomas gradually revealed more details about James's true parentage, watching carefully to see how the young man handled each revelation. James proved to be remarkably mature and thoughtful, asking intelligent questions and showing more concern for his biological mother's well-being than anger about being deceived. When Thomas finally revealed that James's mother was the Queen of England, the young man's reaction surprised him. Rather than shock or disbelief, James showed a sense of recognition, as if this information confirmed something he had always suspected but never dared to believe. James explained that he had always felt an inexplicable connection to the royal family and had often wondered why he looked so much like Prince Charles and the other members of the Windsor family. He had dismissed these thoughts as wishful thinking, but now they made perfect sense. The revelation about his father's identity was more difficult for James to process. Learning that his biological father was someone deemed unsuitable by the royal establishment raised questions about class, social expectations, and the sacrifices people make for duty versus love. James struggled with understanding how love could be considered wrong simply because of social status. Thomas spent considerable time explaining the complex pressures and expectations that govern royal life. He helped James understand that his mother had been forced to choose between personal happiness and her duty to the crown, and that giving up her son had been the most difficult decision of her life. The most emotional moment came when Thomas shared his observations of the Queen's behavior over the years. He described how she had suffered in silence, how she made excuses to visit James's area of the country, and how she treasured the brief moments when she could see her son from a distance. James was moved to tears learning about his mother's pain and sacrifice. James asked whether there was any possibility of meeting his biological mother, even in secret. Thomas explained the enormous risks involved, but promised to explore whether some kind of carefully arranged meeting might be possible. He emphasized that any such meeting would have to be planned with extreme care to protect both James and the Queen from scandal. Before they parted that evening, Thomas gave James a small photograph that had been taken of the Queen holding him as a baby, moments before he was taken to the Mitchell family. It was the only picture that existed of mother and son together, and James held it with trembling hands as he realized he was looking at the most precious and dangerous photograph in Britain. Thomas made James promise to continue living with the Mitchell family and to tell no one about what he had learned. The young man's safety and the Queen's reputation both depended on maintaining absolute secrecy while they figured out how to handle this impossible situation. As they walked back down the chapel path in darkness, both Thomas and James understood that their lives had been forever changed by this conversation. James now knew the truth about his identity, but that knowledge came with enormous responsibility and the burden of keeping one of the most explosive secrets in British history. The young man's maturity and emotional strength gave Thomas hope that they might be able to find a way for James to have some kind of relationship with his biological mother, even if it had to remain hidden from the world. But first they needed to figure out how to tell the Queen that her carefully guarded secret was no longer secret, and that her son was ready to meet the mother he had never known. Telling the Queen that her son knew the truth proved to be one of the most challenging tasks Thomas had ever faced. He spent weeks planning how to approach her, without triggering a crisis that could destroy both the monarchy and James's carefully constructed life with the Mitchell family. The opportunity came during a routine security briefing at Windsor Castle. Thomas had requested a private meeting with the Queen, claiming he had sensitive information about potential threats to her safety. This was technically true, though the threat he needed to discuss was not the kind anyone would expect. When they were alone in her private study, Thomas struggled to find the right words to begin. The Queen sensed his discomfort and asked directly what was troubling him. Taking a deep breath, Thomas told her that James Mitchell had learned about his true parentage and was requesting a meeting with his biological mother. The Queen's reaction was immediate and intense. Her face went pale and she had to steady herself against her desk. For several minutes she couldn't speak, overwhelmed by the emotions that she had been suppressing for 16 years. When she finally found her voice, her first concern was for James's safety and well-being. Thomas assured her that James had handled the revelation with remarkable maturity and discretion. He explained that the young man was not angry or demanding, but simply wanted to understand his heritage and perhaps meet the mother who had given him life. The Queen listened carefully as Thomas described their conversation and James's reaction to learning the truth. What surprised Thomas most was the Queen's immediate acceptance of the situation. Rather than anger at Thomas for revealing the secret or panic about potential exposure, she showed relief that the burden of deception might finally be lifted, at least partially. She had carried this secret for so long that the possibility of some kind of honest relationship with her son seemed like a miracle, even if it had to remain hidden from the world. The Queen asked detailed questions about James's life, education, and character. Thomas was able to share years of observations, describing the young man's intelligence, kindness, and natural leadership abilities. He told her about James's academic achievements, his popularity among his peers, and his instinctive sense of duty and service that reminded Thomas so strongly of the Queen herself. Planning a secret meeting between the Queen and James required extraordinary precautions. They decided to use one of the Queen's private hunting lodges in Scotland, a remote location that was rarely visited by staff or security personnel. The meeting would be arranged during one of the Queen's regular private retreats, when her absence from public duties would not be questioned. Thomas coordinated every detail of the logistics. James would travel to Scotland under the pretense of a hiking holiday, staying at a nearby youth hostel to avoid suspicion. The Queen would arrive at the hunting lodge with only Thomas as security, using a cover story about needing solitude for private reflection and prayer. The days leading up to the meeting were filled with anxiety for everyone involved. James struggled with nervousness about meeting the most famous woman in the world, who also happened to be his mother. The Queen battled her own emotions, torn between excitement at finally meeting her son and fear about how their relationship might develop. On the appointed day, Thomas drove James to the hunting lodge, both of them silent during the long journey through the Scottish Highlands. The young man had dressed carefully in his best clothes, wanting to make a good impression on the mother he had never known. Thomas could see that James was trying to project confidence, but his hands were shaking with nervous energy. The Queen had arrived at the lodge the previous evening and had spent hours walking the grounds, trying to prepare herself emotionally for this moment. When Thomas's car approached, she was standing at a window watching the road with intense anticipation. The first meeting between mother and son was both awkward and deeply moving. James had practiced what he would say, but when he saw the Queen, all his prepared words disappeared. He simply stood there looking at the woman who had given him life, while she studied the young man who carried her features and her bloodline. The Queen broke the silence by walking toward James with tears in her eyes. Without saying a word, she reached out and gently touched his face as if she needed to confirm that he was real. James stood perfectly still, overwhelmed by the reality of meeting his biological mother after 16 years of wondering about her identity. Their first conversation lasted for hours. The Queen wanted to know everything about James's life with the Mitchell family, his education, his interests, and his dreams for the future. James asked thoughtful questions about royal life and the pressures that came with being born into the most famous family in the world. What emerged from their conversation was a natural connection that went beyond their biological relationship. James possessed the same sense of duty and service that drove the Queen, the same concern for others' well-being, and the same ability to remain calm under pressure. These shared qualities created an immediate bond between them. The Queen was struck by how different James was from Prince Charles, despite their similar upbringing. While Charles had grown up with the weight of expectation and public scrutiny, James had developed confidence and independence through living a normal life among ordinary people. He possessed a perspective on the world that the Queen found both refreshing and valuable. James expressed surprise at his mother's warmth and accessibility. He had expected the Queen to be formal and distant, but instead found a woman who was genuinely interested in his thoughts and feelings. She asked about his relationship with the Mitchell family and was pleased to learn that he loved them deeply and had no intention of abandoning them. The most difficult part of their conversation involved discussing the future. James understood that he could never be publicly acknowledged as the Queen's son, and he accepted this reality with maturity that impressed both the Queen and Thomas. However, he hoped that they might be able to maintain some kind of secret relationship that would allow him to know his biological family. The Queen promised that they would find ways to meet regularly, though always in secret and with careful planning. She also expressed interest in helping James with his education and future career, though any assistance would have to be provided discreetly through intermediaries. Before James left the lodge, the Queen gave him a signet ring that had belonged to her father. It was a simple piece of jewelry that wouldn't attract attention, but it carried deep symbolic meaning as a connection to his royal heritage. James accepted the ring with gratitude, understanding the trust and affection it represented. Their farewell was emotional but hopeful. Both mother and son felt that they had begun something important, a relationship that would have to exist in the shadows, but could still provide meaning and connection for both of them. The Queen promised Thomas that she would find ways to ensure James's future security and success, even if she could never publicly claim him as her son. As Thomas drove James back to England, Both men understood that their lives had changed forever. The terrible secret that had burdened them for so long had been transformed into something more positive, a hidden relationship that brought joy to both the Queen and her son, while still protecting the monarchy from scandal. Over the following years, Thomas watched as the secret relationship between the Queen and James blossomed in ways no one could have predicted. They met regularly at various remote locations, always with Thomas coordinating the security and logistics. What began as awkward emotional encounters gradually developed into a genuine mother-son bond that enriched both their lives. James continued living with the Mitchell family, but his perspective on life changed dramatically after meeting his biological mother. He understood now why he had always felt different, and this knowledge gave him a sense of peace and purpose he had never experienced before. His academic performance improved even further, and he began focusing his studies on subjects that would prepare him for a life of service, though he still didn't know exactly what form that service would take. The Queen, meanwhile, found unexpected joy in these secret meetings with her son. James brought a fresh perspective to her understanding of the world outside the palace walls. Through his stories about ordinary life with the Mitchell family, she gained insights into how regular British citizens lived, worked, and thought about their government and their Queen. Their relationship deepened when James turned 18 and faced decisions about his future. The Queen wanted to help guide his choices, but she had to be careful not to interfere in ways that might raise suspicions about their connection. Through Thomas as an intermediary, she arranged for James to receive a scholarship to Oxford University, where he could pursue his interests in history and international relations. At Oxford, James excelled academically and socially. His natural leadership abilities and genuine interest in helping others made him popular among his fellow students. He joined several charitable organizations and showed particular interest in causes related to poverty and social justice. Thomas, who continued to monitor James's activities, reported back to the Queen about her son's growing reputation as a young man of character and principle. The Queen was proud of James's achievements, but she also worried about the attention his success was attracting. Several professors at Oxford had commented on James's unusual maturity and natural leadership qualities. One historian even remarked that James possessed the kind of presence and dignity typically associated with members of the royal family, though the professor meant this as a compliment rather than a serious observation about James's heritage. The most challenging moment came during James's second year at Oxford when a genealogy enthusiast began researching the Mitchell family history as part of a local historical project. The researcher was puzzled by inconsistencies in James's birth records and began asking questions that made Thomas extremely nervous. The situation required immediate intervention. To protect James's secret, Thomas worked with Palace contacts to provide the researcher with convincing but false documentation that would satisfy their curiosity without revealing the truth. The incident reminded everyone involved that maintaining James's secret required constant vigilance and careful management of any situations that might expose inconsistencies in his official background. During this period, James began to understand the enormous complexity of his situation. He could never pursue certain careers that might subject him to intense public scrutiny or security clearances that could reveal his true parentage. This limitation frustrated him, as he had been considering diplomatic service or politics, both fields where his natural abilities would have served him well. The Queen recognized her son's frustration and began exploring alternative ways he could serve his country while maintaining his anonymity. She learned about various charitable foundations and international organizations that could benefit from James's talents without exposing him to the kind of background investigations that government positions would require. Their secret meetings became more frequent during James's university years, often disguised as the Queen's private visits to historical sites or charitable events in areas near Oxford. Thomas developed an elaborate system of signals and cover stories that allowed mother and son to spend time together without arousing suspicion from palace staff or security personnel. During one particularly memorable meeting at a secluded monastery in the Cotswolds, the Queen shared family photographs with James that he had never seen before. She showed him pictures of his grandparents, great-grandparents, and other relatives, helping him understand his place in the long line of British royal history. James was fascinated to learn about his heritage and began to understand the weight of responsibility that came with his bloodline, even if he could never publicly claim it. The Queen also began sharing with James some of the more personal challenges of royal life. She spoke about the loneliness that came with her position, the constant public scrutiny, and the difficulty of balancing duty with personal happiness. These conversations helped James understand why his mother had made the painful decision to give him up, and he developed deep respect for the sacrifices she had made throughout her life. James's relationship with the Mitchell family remained strong throughout this period. Robert and Mary Mitchell had raised him with love and kindness, and he felt genuine affection and loyalty toward them. However, as he learned more about his royal heritage, James sometimes struggled with feeling torn between two families and two very different worlds. The Queen was careful to encourage James's continued devotion to his adoptive parents. She understood that the Mitchell family had given her son something she never could have provided, a normal childhood filled with unconditional love and freedom from public expectations. She was grateful to them for raising James to be such a remarkable young man. As James approached graduation from Oxford, both he and the Queen faced difficult questions about his future. He was academically qualified for prestigious positions in government, diplomacy, or academia, but his secret heritage made many of these paths too dangerous to pursue. They needed to find a way for James to use his abilities in meaningful work, while maintaining the anonymity that protected both him and the royal family. The solution came from an unexpected source. Prince Philip, who had learned about James's existence several years earlier, suggested that the young man might find fulfillment working for international humanitarian organizations. These positions would allow James to serve others and make a positive impact on the world while operating largely outside the spotlight of British media and government scrutiny. Thomas was initially concerned about involving Prince Philip in their secret, but the Queen assured him that her husband could be trusted completely. Prince Philip's practical nature and experience with complex situations made him a valuable ally in planning James's future while maintaining the security of their secret. The plan they developed would take James far from Britain for several years, allowing him to build a career and establish his adult identity in environments where questions about his background would be less likely to arise. It was a solution that offered James meaningful work and personal fulfillment, while protecting the secret that all of them had worked so hard to maintain. 40 years have passed since James learned the truth about his parentage, and Thomas Whitmore now sits in his cottage, finally ready to reveal the secret he has carried for 7 decades. James, now 58 years old, has built a distinguished career working for international humanitarian organizations, just as Prince Philip had suggested. He has spent his adult life helping refugees, coordinating disaster relief, and working to improve conditions in some of the world's most challenging regions. The Queen and James maintained their secret relationship throughout all these years, meeting whenever possible, and staying in touch through carefully managed communications. Thomas continued to facilitate these meetings until his retirement in 1995, after which other trusted palace staff took over the responsibility of maintaining the connection between mother and son. James married a fellow humanitarian worker named Catherine, a kind and intelligent woman who knows nothing about her husband's royal heritage. They have 2 children together, a daughter named Elizabeth and a son named Philip, though James chose these names as private tributes to his biological grandparents rather than obvious references to his royal connections. The Queen has watched her hidden family grow from a distance, taking quiet pride in James's achievements and the good man he has become. She has never met her grandchildren, but Thomas knows that she keeps photographs of them in her private study and follows their progress through reports that James provides during their secret meetings. Throughout the decades, James has proven himself to be everything the Queen could have hoped for in a son. He inherited her sense of duty and service, but he has been able to express these qualities in ways that she never could. His work has taken him to war zones, refugee camps, and disaster areas where he has literally saved lives and brought hope to people in desperate situations. The irony has not been lost on any of them that James, who was hidden away to protect the monarchy, has probably done more good for Britain's reputation around the world than many officially recognized members of the royal family. His humanitarian work has earned respect for British values and compassion in countries where the royal family's influence might not otherwise reach. Thomas reveals that James has been awarded several international honors for his humanitarian work, though these ceremonies were kept quiet to avoid media attention that might lead to unwanted scrutiny of his background. The Queen has been privately briefed about each of these achievements and considers them among her proudest moments, even though she can never publicly acknowledge her connection to them. The secret has remained safe all these years through the careful management of a small group of trusted individuals. Several people who knew the truth have taken the secret to their graves, while others, like Thomas, have carried the burden in silence until now. The Queen's private secretary, Sir William Hartley, passed away in 1987, but not before ensuring that future arrangements for maintaining the secret were put in place. Robert and Mary Mitchell lived to see James succeed at Oxford and begin his international career. Though they never learned the truth about his parentage, they died knowing only that they had raised a remarkable young man who had gone on to do important work in the world. James mourned their deaths deeply and continues to honor their memory by living according to the values they taught. The most poignant aspect of Thomas's story is his description of the Queen's current relationship with James. Now in her late 90s, she knows that their time together is limited. Their meetings have become more frequent in recent years, with James making regular trips back to Britain under the cover of consulting work for international organizations. During these visits, the Queen and James spend time discussing his children and their futures. Elizabeth, now 25, is a doctor working in refugee camps, following in her father's footsteps without knowing she is serving a family tradition of duty and service. Philip, 23, is studying international law and hopes to work for human rights organizations. The Queen has expressed to Thomas her wish that someday, after her death, James might be able to tell his children about their royal heritage. She understands that this knowledge would be their decision to accept or reject, but she hopes they might find some comfort in knowing that their sense of duty and service comes from a long family tradition. Thomas reveals that James has struggled in recent years with the question of whether to tell his own children the truth. He watches them display the same natural leadership qualities and instinctive compassion that run in the royal bloodline, and he wonders whether they have a right to know about their heritage. However, he also understands the dangers that such knowledge could bring to their lives and careers. The decision about the future of the secret now rests with James. The Queen has told him that after her death, he will be free to make his own choices about what to reveal and to whom. She trusts his judgment completely and knows that whatever he decides will be motivated by love and concern for his family's well-being. Thomas concludes his story by explaining why he has finally decided to speak. At 89, he knows his own time is limited, and he feels that the world deserves to know about the remarkable man who has spent his life serving others while carrying one of the most extraordinary secrets in modern history. He believes that James's story demonstrates the best qualities of both the royal family and ordinary British citizens. The old guard emphasizes that his decision to reveal the secret now is not motivated by any desire to cause scandal or harm to the royal family. Instead, he hopes that people will understand the human cost of the sacrifices that public figures sometimes make for duty, and the way that love can persist even in the most impossible circumstances. Thomas's final words are a tribute to both the Queen and James. He describes them as two remarkable people who found a way to maintain a loving relationship despite circumstances that could have destroyed them both. Their story, he believes, shows that family bonds can survive even the most challenging situations when they are built on genuine love, respect, and understanding. As Thomas finishes his story, he expresses hope that James will someday be able to step into the light and receive the recognition he deserves for his lifetime of service. Whether that happens during the Queen's lifetime or after her death, Thomas believes that the world will be amazed by the story of the royal son who spent his life helping others while keeping the most extraordinary secret in British history.